If they truly didn't care, they wouldn't need to distance this hard. Avoidants rarely experience guilt in ways that are visible or expressive. They don't sit with it long enough to articulate it, and they certainly don't move toward conversation to resolve it. Instead, guilt collapses inward. It becomes withdrawal, emotional muting, and an almost reflexive need to create distance. What looks like indifference from the outside is often an internal shutdown, not because nothing was felt, but because what was felt became too confronting to stay present with. For an avoidant, recognizing that they hurt someone who showed up with sincerity is destabilizing. It threatens the carefully maintained self-image of being low maintenance, reasonable, or not the problem. Shame enters when they sense that their behavior caused real emotional impact, especially when that impact can't be dismissed as drama or neediness. Rather than face that awareness directly, they retreat. Distance becomes a form of emotional anesthesia. This is why silence from an avoidant should never be mistaken for peace or resolution. Silence is not calm, clarity, it's containment, it's the attempt to seal off emotions they don't know how to metabolize. When they disappear, minimize, or go cold, they are not proving strength or certainty. They are protecting themselves from the discomfort of accountability, from the quiet realization that someone was patient, understanding, and still left holding pain. What makes this pattern especially confusing is that the avoidant may genuinely believe their own withdrawal is logical or necessary. They tell themselves they're creating space, not leading you on or doing the mature thing. But underneath those explanations is an unprocessed emotional weight. Shame doesn't announce itself loudly in avoidance. It disguises itself as detachment, busyness, or emotional neutrality. The intensity of the distancing often correlates with the depth of the connection. The more safe, steady, or emotionally available you were, the harder it becomes for them to reconcile how they responded. Your grounded presence mirrors the gap in theirs, and rather than confront that gap, they step away from the mirror entirely. This is also why avoidants rarely revisit the moment directly. Talking about it would require naming impact, sitting with discomfort, and staying emotionally open without escape. That skill was never built. So instead, they manage shame by erasing the environment that triggers it, which often means erasing you from their immediate emotional field. Understanding this doesn't excuse the behavior, but it reframes it. You weren't ignored because you lacked value. You were distanced from because your presence stirred awareness. They weren't equipped to hold. Silence wasn't proof that it didn't matter. It was proof that it mattered more than they knew how to face. An apology would force them to feel what they've spent a lifetime avoiding. For an avoidant, an apology is not a simple social repair. It's an emotional exposure. To apologize properly requires naming the impact of their behavior, acknowledging emotional responsibility, and remaining present while discomfort rises instead of escaping it. Those steps may seem basic to securely attached people, but to an avoidant, they represent a direct collision with everything they learned to suppress in order to function. Apologizing means slowing down long enough to feel. It means allowing regret, guilt, or remorse to surface without immediately neutralizing them. For someone whose nervous system associates emotional intensity with danger or loss of control, this can feel destabilizing, not uncomfortable, threatening. Their system doesn't register accountability as growth, it registers it as vulnerability without protection. This is why avoidants often offer partial apologies that never quite land. You might hear statements that explain behavior without owning its impact, or acknowledgments that sound logical but lack emotional presence. They may say, "I didn't mean to hurt you," instead of "I see how my actions caused pain." The first protects intent. The second requires empathy, and empathy, when directed at someone they disappointed, forces them to confront themselves. Minimization becomes a defense here. If the issue wasn't that serious, then the guilt doesn't have to be either. Deflection follows close behind, shifting focus to timing, circumstances, or your reaction instead of their withdrawal. And when neither minimization nor deflection fully contain the discomfort, disappearance becomes the final option. Distance shuts down the emotional demand entirely. What's often misunderstood is that this pattern isn't rooted in arrogance or lack of care. It's rooted in emotional skill deficit. Many avoidants were never taught how to remain connected while experiencing shame. Their early environments rewarded self reliance, composure, or emotional silence, not repair. So, when repair is required, they default to the strategies that once kept them safe. Apologizing also threatens their internal narrative. Many avoidants see themselves as reasonable, independent, and low drama. A full apology would require admitting that their coping strategy caused harm, that withdrawal isn't neutral, and silence carries weight. That realization fractures the story they've told themselves to stay regulated. This is why they may reframe the situation instead of repairing it. They tell themselves the connection was misaligned, the timing was wrong, or emotions were incompatible. These explanations reduce internal tension without requiring growth. They don't heal the rupture, they justify leaving it unaddressed. For the person on the receiving end, this absence of a real apology can be deeply painful. It creates a sense of invisibility, as if your experience never fully registered. But the lack of apology isn't proof that your pain wasn't real or seen. It's proof that acknowledging it would have required an emotional capacity they haven't yet developed. Understanding this can bring clarity, but it shouldn't invite self-abandonment. You don't need to lower your standards for repair just because someone else can't meet them. An explanation is not the same as accountability, and a relationship that can't hold an honest apology will always struggle to hold genuine intimacy. They don't pull away because they feel nothing. They pull away because they feel too much. For an avoidant, guilt is not processed through conversation, repair, or emotional closeness. It's processed through space. Distance becomes the regulator. When emotions rise beyond what their nervous system can hold, withdrawal is not a choice, it's a reflex. And guilt, especially guilt tied to hurting someone who showed up sincerely, is one of the most overwhelming emotions they encounter. Seeing you becomes a mirror they can't tolerate for long. Your presence reminds them of what they couldn't sustain, the consistency, the emotional availability, the expectation of mutuality. It highlights how they shut down instead of showing up, how they chose familiarity over vulnerability, safety over connection. None of this feels neutral inside them. It registers as failure, inadequacy, and shame. Rather than sit with that awareness, the avoidant creates distance, physical distance, emotional distance, psychological distance, not because they want to erase you, but because proximity activates the part of them that knows they didn't handle the connection well. Distance dulls the intensity. It quiets the internal dialogue. It allows them to function without being confronted by the emotional consequences of their choices. This is why their withdrawal can feel sudden or disproportionate. It's not about a single interaction or disagreement. It's about accumulation. Every moment you remained open while they stayed guarded added weight. Every time you expressed clarity while they avoided depth, increased internal pressure. Eventually, their system seeks relief, and distance provides it fastest. From the outside, this looks like coldness, like indifference, like someone who moved on without a second thought. But internally, it's often the opposite. They are managing a surge of feelings they don't know how to regulate while staying connected. Guilt, for an avoidant, is not motivating, it's paralyzing, and paralysis demands escape. What makes this especially painful is that the person who triggered their guilt is often the person who treated them with the most care. You didn't create the shame, you revealed it. Your emotional availability illuminated the gap between who they believed themselves to be and how they actually showed up. And instead of stepping into that gap, they stepped away from you. Distance becomes a form of self-soothing. It allows them to compartmentalize the connection, to tuck it away as something unresolved, but no longer activated. It's not healing, it's management. And it only works as long as contact is limited. If they can make you too much, they don't have to face their absence. Distance alone doesn't fully resolve shame. The mind still needs a narrative that justifies the withdrawal. This is where rewriting the story begins. Avoidants often revise the meaning of the connection, not to punish you, but to protect their self-image from fracture. Shame looks for justification, and narrative is its most effective tool. If they can frame you as demanding, then their emotional absence becomes reasonable. If the timing was wrong, then their lack of follow-through isn't a personal failure, it's circumstantial. If the connection wasn't that deep, then the impact of their withdrawal doesn't have to be acknowledged. Each revision softens the internal blow. This reframing isn't always conscious or malicious. It's a psychological defense. Admitting that someone was patient, emotionally available, and still left hurt by their behavior would require confronting their limitations directly. That level of honesty destabilizes the identity they rely on to feel regulated and in control. So instead, the story shifts. You were too emotional, too invested, asking for too much clarity, wanting too much reassurance. The labels don't reflect your reality. They reflect the avoidance capacity. Anything that required presence felt excessive. Anything that asked for consistency felt threatening. But rather than name that, the narrative relocates the problem onto you. This rewriting also helps them maintain distance without guilt. If you were the issue, then withdrawal becomes self-protection rather than avoidance. It transforms shame into logic, and logic feels safer than vulnerability. What's rarely acknowledged is that these narratives often crumble over time, especially once you stop engaging, explaining, or trying to be understood. When you leave clean without dramatizing, chasing, or defending yourself, the justifications lose their audience. And without constant reinforcement, the story begins to feel thin. That's when quiet awareness sets in. They remember the steadiness you offered, the moments you stayed regulated while they withdrew, the emotional clarity you brought without pressure. And the revised version of events starts to feel less convincing than it once did. This doesn't mean they'll reach out. Awareness doesn't automatically create repair, but it does explain why avoidants often carry unresolved emotional weight long after a connection ends. They didn't escape the impact. They deferred it. For you, the important truth is this: their distance and their rewritten story were never accurate reflections of your worth. They were survival strategies, attempts to manage guilt without growth. And while understanding this can bring perspective, it should never require you to question your reality. You weren't too much. You were present. And presence exposes avoidance, not because it's wrong, but because it asks for something they didn't yet know how to give. They watch from a distance because direct contact feels exposing. After the distance is created and the story has been rewritten, many avoidants don't actually detach in the way it appears. Instead, they shift into observation mode. They watch quietly from afar, not to interfere, but to stay emotionally informed without becoming emotionally involved. This is the silent checking behavior that confuses so many people because it contradicts the image of someone who supposedly didn't care. They may check your socials more often than they'd admit, scroll past your updates late at night, notice changes in your energy, your presence, your life. Some ask about you indirectly through mutual connections, disguising curiosity as casual interest. Others reappear briefly, a message, a reaction, a neutral check-in, never deep enough to open a real conversation, but just enough to feel connected again. This behavior isn't about manipulation or control, it's about unresolved awareness paired with emotional limitation. Direct contact would require vulnerability. It would invite questions they're not prepared to answer and emotions they're not equipped to regulate. Watching from a distance feels safer. It offers proximity without exposure. For an avoidant, contact equals risk. It risks reactivating guilt, longing, or the awareness that something meaningful was mishandled. Observation, on the other hand, provides a sense of connection without demanding response. They get to know how you're doing without having to show how they are. It's a way to stay emotionally adjacent while remaining protected. This is why their reappearances often feel oddly flat. There's no depth, no ownership, no forward movement, just enough presence to remind themselves that the bond existed and that they still exist in your world. When the taurine starts to move toward anything real, they pull back again. Exposure increases. The nervous system reacts. Distance is reinstated. What's important to understand is that this behavior usually intensifies when you stop chasing, when you stop explaining, clarifying, or seeking validation. The emotional balance shifts. You're no longer doing the relational work for both people. And in that silence, their awareness has more room to surface. They notice your absence more when you're no longer trying to be seen. They feel the weight of the connection more when it's no longer available for passive consumption. But even then, many avoidants remain observers rather than participants. Knowing is safer than engaging. Watching is safer than showing up. For you, this can be disorienting. It can feel like mixed signals, unfinished business, or a door that's still slightly open. But the key truth is this: silent checking is not the same as readiness. It reflects unresolved emotion, not relational capacity. And you don't need to respond to observation with access. Closure would require them to sit in accountability, not explanation. Many people wait for closure, believing it will come through a conversation, a final explanation, a moment of clarity that puts everything into place. But with avoidance, closure is rarely withheld out of cruelty. It's avoided because real closure demands something they struggle to offer: sustained emotional presence in the face of discomfort. Avoidants can explain themselves endlessly. They can talk about timing, stress, confusion, or personal growth. They can intellectualize the relationship until it sounds reasonable and clean. But explanation is not the same as accountability. Explanation keeps emotions at arm's length. Accountability requires staying present with the emotional impact of their actions without minimizing, defending, or escaping. To offer true closure, they would have to acknowledge how their withdrawal affected you. They would need to listen without controlling the narrative. They would have to tolerate guilt without shutting down. For many avoidants, that level of emotional exposure feels unbearable. So instead, the conversation never happens, or it stays superficial. This is why attempts at closure often feel unsatisfying. You may get answers, but not acknowledgement, words but not repair, logic but not empathy. The moment the conversation starts to move toward emotional responsibility, the avoidant disengages, changes the subject, becomes vague, or disappears entirely. It's not that they don't understand what happened. On some level, they do. But understanding is safer than owning. Ownership threatens the defenses they've relied on to stay regulated their entire lives. What's rarely said is that closure doesn't require mutual participation. Waiting for someone who can't sit in accountability keeps you emotionally tethered to their limitations. And in many cases, the closure you're seeking won't come from them. It comes from recognizing that the absence of repair is the information. You didn't miss the conversation because you weren't clear enough or patient enough. You missed it because they couldn't stay emotionally present long enough to have it. That distinction matters. When you stop waiting for closure to be given, you reclaim your agency. You allow the story to end without permission. And paradoxically, that's often when the avoidant feels the weight of what was left unresolved, not because you demanded it, but because you no longer needed them to validate your experience. Closure isn't a conversation they refuse to give, it's a capacity they haven't built yet. And you are not required to pause your healing at the edge of someone else's emotional ceiling. They didn't leave because you weren't enough. They left because you required presence. One of the most damaging beliefs people carry after being involved with an avoidant is the idea that something about them was excessive, flawed, or unlovable. That if they had been calmer, less expressive, less invested, things might have worked. But this story collapses under scrutiny. The truth is far less personal and far more structural. They didn't leave because you lacked value. They left because the relationship asked for presence, and presence is the one thing avoidance struggles to. Your consistency wasn't the threat. It was the contrast. You showed up steadily without emotional volatility or games. That level of reliability quietly exposes avoidance because it removes excuses. There's nothing chaotic to blame, no drama to hide behind, just the expectation of mutual engagement. And for someone whose nervous system equates closeness with loss of autonomy, that expectation can feel suffocating, even when it's healthy. Your needs didn't overwhelm them. Needs only feel overwhelming to someone who doesn't know how to respond to them without self-erasure. You weren't asking for constant reassurance or emotional performance. You were asking for clarity, continuity, and emotional availability. Those are not excessive requests. They're foundational requirements for intimacy. But for an avoidant, they register as pressure because they require staying present when discomfort arises. Your emotional clarity was especially confronting. You named feelings instead of hinting. You addressed disconnection instead of ignoring it. You asked questions that move the relationship forward instead of pretending everything was fine. That clarity mirrors the places an avoidant has learned to bypass. It highlights the internal gaps they've learned to survive around, not by filling them, but by stepping away from anything that points to them. This is why avoidants often seem more comfortable with ambiguity or emotionally unavailable partners. It's not because those connections are healthier, it's because they demand less presence, less accountability, less sustained engagement. You didn't fail because you wanted more. You simply arrived with a level of emotional readiness that made avoidance visible. And when avoidance becomes visible, it often retreats, not in anger, not in certainty, but in quiet withdrawal. The story that you were too much becomes a convenient cover for the deeper truth. They weren't ready to meet what you brought. They feel it after you stop chasing, not while you're still available. Shame doesn't surface for avoidance while you're still trying, as long as you're explaining, accommodating, softening your needs, or offering endless understanding. Their system stays regulated. Your effort buffers them from consequence. It gives them emotional cover. And as long as that cover exists, self-reflection is postponed. Shame emerges later in the absence, after you leave clean. Leaving clean doesn't mean cutting off with anger or making a dramatic exit. It means you stop negotiating for basic presence. You stop proving your worth. You stop shrinking yourself to maintain access. You disengage in debt punishment without bitterness and without abandoning your sense of self. You don't beg. You don't dramatize. You don't chase closure that requires them to be someone they're not. And that's when the emotional landscape changes. Without your availability as a buffer, there's nothing left to externalize discomfort onto, no ongoing interaction to reinterpret, no dynamic to manage. The avoidant is left alone with the memory of how the connection ended, not explosively, not cruelly, but quietly. And quiet is where shame finally has space to surface. They replay moments they avoided. They remember conversations they deflected. They feel the absence of someone who didn't demand, but did expect. This is when awareness becomes unavoidable because nothing distracts them from the truth anymore. Your clean exit removes the narrative that you were too emotional or asking for too much. You didn't chase. You didn't collapse. You didn't punish them with chaos. You simply withdrew your presence. And that kind of departure is harder to rationalize. For many avoidants, this is the first time they experience the emotional cost of their pattern without escape. There's no immediate relief through distance because the distance is now permanent, and with permanence comes reflection. This doesn't mean they will reach out. It doesn't mean they will apologize, and it doesn't mean they will change. But it does mean the truth lands. They recognize, often silently, that someone showed up with maturity and emotional integrity, and they couldn't meet it. That realization carries weight, not because you forced it, but because you stopped cushioning them from it. And this is the most important part. Their delayed shame is not your responsibility to manage or wait for. Healing does not require their awakening. Your growth doesn't depend on their awareness. You don't need them to validate what you already lived. You didn't lose something because you were insufficient. You stepped out of something because you were aligned with yourself. And that alignment, quiet, grounded, and self-respecting, is what lingers long after the connection ends. Not because you tried harder, but because you left whole. Healing starts when they stop running from their own emotional impact. Healing for an avoidant does not look like sudden insight, dramatic apologies, or emotionally fluent conversations that arrive years too late. It's rarely visible from the outside, and it almost never begins with another person. It begins privately, internally, and often uncomfortably when they can no longer outrun the emotional residue of their own patterns. For many avoidants, this moment never comes. Not because they are incapable of growth, but because avoidance is an effective short-term strategy. It works. Distance regulates their nervous system. Independence shields them from vulnerability. Reframing keeps their self-image intact. As long as those strategies continue to function, there is little incentive to change. Healing only begins when those strategies stop working. This usually happens later in life or across repeated relational losses when the same outcome keeps appearing despite different partners. The faces change, the dynamic doesn't. At some point, the pattern becomes harder to ignore than the discomfort of facing it, and that's where healing, real healing, quietly begins. It starts with impact, not intention, not explanation. They begin to recognize how their withdrawal affected others, how silence carried weight, how needing space often meant leaving someone alone in uncertainty. This recognition isn't loud or performative, it's often heavy, unsettling, and deeply private. From there, healing requires something avoidance were never trained to do: stay present while uncomfortable emotions arise. Guilt without escape, shame without justification, longing without immediate suppression. This is slow nervous system work, not intellectual insight, and it cannot be rushed, coached, or outsourced to a partner. Some avoidants do reach this place quietly, slowly, often after years of repeating the same pattern and wondering why intimacy always feels just out of reach. Others never do. They continue building lives that look functional on the surface, but lack emotional depth. Neither outcome is something you could have influenced by loving harder. And this is the part people struggle to accept. Your presence did not cause their healing, and your absence did not delay it. Their healing is not a reward for your patience or a punishment for your boundaries. It's a choice that only becomes available when they are willing to sit with themselves honestly. Your role was never to carry them there. You were not meant to be the lesson, the therapist, or the emotional training ground. You were a participant in a relationship that required mutual presence. When that presence couldn't be sustained, the relationship ended, not because you failed, but because the capacity wasn't there. You weren't forgotten. You were formative. One of the quiet fears people carry after being hurt by an avoidant is that they were easily replaced, that the connection was disposable, that if it truly mattered, it would have been handled differently. But this fear misunderstands avoidance, internalized impact. Not everyone who hurts you is careless. Some are ashamed, but unskilled. They don't lack conscience, they lack capacity. And the connections that affect them most are often the ones they don't know how to hold. You were formative not because you stayed longer or tried harder, but because you showed up with emotional integrity. You asked for presence without aggression. You offered consistency without control. You didn't abandon yourself to be chosen. That kind of experience leaves a mark, even if it's never named out loud. Formative doesn't mean remembered in the way you hope. It doesn't guarantee contact, apologies, or repair. It means you contributed to awareness. You interrupted a pattern. You became a reference point for what real connection. Understanding this can bring peace, not by rewriting the past, but by releasing the need to be validated by someone who couldn't meet you there. Compassion and boundaries are not opposites. You can understand their limitations without accepting less than you deserve. You don't need to demonize them to move on, and you don't need their growth to justify your exit. The truth stands on its own. You were willing to be present, and that mattered. The real closure isn't in being chosen by someone who wasn't ready. It's in choosing yourself without resentment, in walking away whole, in knowing that the connection wasn't lost because you were lacking. It ended because you required something real, and that will never be a flaw.